August 3rd, 2026. Right now, 60,000 people in Spokane, Washington don't have homes to return to tonight, or don't know yet whether they will. 3 fast-moving wildfires tore through the edges of the state's second-largest city over the weekend, destroying at least 600 structures, forcing what officials describe as the largest mass evacuation the region has seen in generations, and doing it all in a matter of hours rather than days. Governor Bob Ferguson has declared a statewide emergency. More than 100 National Guard troops are on the ground, and crews from more than a dozen states, along with international support from Australia, are now racing to contain fires that, as of this weekend, remain largely uncontained. So today we're breaking down exactly how this escalated so fast, what firefighters mean when they say the weather and the terrain are both working against them, how this fits into the broader heat and fire pattern gripping the entire western United States right now, and what residents in the evacuation zones and anyone watching a fire threat develop near them genuinely need to know. Before we get into it, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap that bell icon so you get notified the moment this situation updates. Because containment on these fires is still at zero and conditions on the ground are changing by the hour. Drop a comment right now. If you've ever had to evacuate your home because of a wildfire, even for a single night, tell me what that experience was actually like, how much warning you got, and what you grabbed on your way out the door. I want to hear the real version of this, not the headline version, because 60,000 people in Spokane are living through exactly that question right now. Now, let's get into exactly what happened. It started, like so many of the West's most destructive fires do, with lightning striking dry ground during an already dangerous stretch of weather. Emergency officials confirmed the fires around Spokane were sparked by lightning strikes, hitting the region during a period of extreme heat and drought, conditions that had already been building for days under the same heat dome that baked much of the western United States over the preceding weekend. 3 separate fires, later identified as the Old Trails Fire, the Fairview Fire, and the Meadowview Fire, ignited in and around Spokane and began spreading with a speed that outpaced initial containment efforts almost immediately. By Sunday, Spokane Fire Chief Tom Williams confirmed the blazes, collectively referred to as the Spokane Area Fire, had burned roughly 5,300 acres, close to 21 square kilometers, and remained entirely uncontained. A 4th major blaze, the Autumn Lane Fire, prompted the largest emergency response of the weekend, and, while officials said crews had achieved what they described as relatively decent control of its boundaries by Sunday, it too remained an active, ongoing fire rather than something firefighters could consider contained in any meaningful sense. The scale of the evacuation order itself is genuinely staggering once you sit with the actual number. Spokane Police Chief Kevin Hall confirmed that approximately 60,000 people were evacuated from within the city limits alone, a mandatory order covering a huge swath of Spokane's population forced to leave their homes with what, for many, residents amounted to almost no advance warning at all. Evacuations in Spokane County remained in effect through the weekend, and officials issued an additional new mandatory evacuation order for parts of neighboring Stevens County near the Spokane River on Sunday afternoon, meaning the affected area was still actively expanding even as crews worked to bring the existing fires under control. State Public Lands Commissioner Dave Upthegrove said at Sunday's news conference that 15 separate wildfires were burning across Washington state at that point, together having consumed roughly 250,000 acres, a figure that dwarfs the acreage burned specifically around Spokane, and underscores just how widespread this fire outbreak has become across the state as a whole. A separate accounting put the total burned area across the entire state closer to 390 square miles, right around 1,000 square kilometers, with officials noting that some of the fires, including those directly threatening Spokane, had not been contained at all as of the weekend's reporting. The property destruction from this weekend's fires is already extensive, and the full scope is still being assessed even now. Spokane County Fire District 3 Fire Chief Cody Rohrbach confirmed that 640 structures were destroyed in the Old Trails wildfire alone, a single fire responsible for the overwhelming majority of the property. Loss reported so far. Authorities said they had not yet determined precisely how many of those destroyed structures were private homes, businesses, or other buildings like schools, a distinction that will matter enormously to the affected community in the weeks ahead as recovery and rebuilding efforts get underway, but one that takes time and careful, methodical assessment to sort out accurately in the immediate aftermath of a fast-moving fire. Corey Hobson, a longtime resident of Spokane's North Indian Trail neighborhood, one of the areas hit hardest by the fires, posted video to social media showing charred trees and blackened ground stretching across what had been his neighborhood just days earlier. He described it directly, saying not every house in the area was destroyed, but a lot of them were, and adding that in 55 years of living in Spokane, he had never seen anything like it. AP photographer Young Kwok documented residential structures reduced entirely to ash across the affected neighborhoods in separate footage. Verified by NBC News showed a local sports complex with smoke visible in the background before it became fully engulfed in flames on Saturday. A stark visual reminder of just how quickly ordinary community landmarks were swallowed by the advancing fires. Despite the scale of destruction, there's genuinely important, positive news buried inside this story, and it's worth stating clearly. As of Sunday's news conference, Spokane County Sheriff John Knowles confirmed that no fire-related serious injuries or deaths had been reported, though officials were careful to note the situation remained ongoing and that number could still change as search and damage assessment efforts continued. Given that 60,000 people were forced to evacuate an area where fires ultimately destroyed hundreds of structures, many at a speed fast enough to catch a sports complex on camera transitioning from smoke in the background to full engulfment within the same clip. The fact that officials are reporting 0 confirmed fatalities so far reflects both fortunate timing and, very likely, the effectiveness of the evacuation orders themselves getting people out of harm's way before the fires reach their homes. It's worth understanding exactly why officials described this weekend's conditions the way they did, because the language used by the incident response team overseeing this fire captures something important about why containment has been so difficult. Benjamin Kossel, a public information officer with the federal response team, called in from California on Saturday night specifically to help manage the fires, put it about as plainly as possible, saying the weather is working against firefighting crews, and the terrain is working against them too. That's not a throwaway line. It's a precise description of the 2 compounding factors that turned what began as a lightning-sparked fire into a 60,000-person evacuation within a matter of hours. On the weather side, while temperatures in Spokane on Sunday were actually forecast to stay relatively moderate for the region, below 80 degrees Fahrenheit, wind gusts were expected to reach 35 to 45 miles an hour by the afternoon. Powerful enough wind to drive active fire fronts rapidly across open and forested terrain alike, pushing flames into new areas faster than ground crews, could realistically establish containment lines ahead of them. On the terrain side, the areas surrounding Spokane include a mix of agricultural land, grassland, and forested areas that had already been stressed by the extended stretch of extreme heat and drought conditions gripping the broader region throughout the preceding weeks. Exactly the kind of parched, easily ignitable landscape that turns a wind-driven fire from a serious but manageable incident into the kind of fast-moving emergency Spokane experienced this weekend. To understand why wind matters so disproportionately to how dangerous a wildfire actually becomes, it helps to walk through the actual fire behavior mechanics at play here, because wind doesn't just push flames sideways the way it might seem intuitively. Strong, sustained wind accomplishes several distinct, compounding things simultaneously that dramatically accelerate a fire's growth and make it far harder to predict or contain. First, wind physically bends flames closer to unburned fuel ahead of the fire's main front, allowing radiant heat to preheat and dry out vegetation before the flame front itself even arrives, effectively priming the next section of terrain to ignite more readily the moment flames reach it. Second, and often more dangerous, wind carries burning embers, sometimes small fragments of burning bark or vegetation, well ahead of a fire's main body, a phenomenon firefighters call spotting, where new, entirely separate fires ignite from wind-carried embers landing on receptive fuel, sometimes a mile or more ahead of the original fire, essentially allowing a fire to leapfrog forward far faster than the main flame front alone could travel. This is precisely the mechanism that turned Spokane's fires from an initial lightning strike into a rapidly expanding emergency covering multiple neighborhoods within the same weekend, since a fire advancing through ember-driven spotting can establish new ignition points across a far wider area than firefighting crews can realistically anticipate and preposition resources to defend. Third, wind directly increases a fire's rate of spread simply by supplying additional oxygen to the combustion process itself, allowing flames to burn more intensely and consume fuel more rapidly than they would under calmer conditions. Combine all 3 of these mechanisms, radiant preheating, ember-driven spotting, and oxygen-fed intensification, with wind gusts reaching 45 miles an hour, and you get exactly the kind of fire behavior that outpaces both firefighting crews and, in the worst cases, outpaces the evacuation timelines residents have to work with. The response effort mobilized to fight these fires reflects just how seriously state and federal authorities are treating this emergency. More than 100 National Guard members are actively assisting the Spokane County community, according to Major General Gent Welsh, the Adjutant General of the Washington National Guard, who specifically asked residents for patience as officials work to safely reopen affected areas and allow displaced families to return to their neighborhoods, a process he said would take real time to complete, safely given the scale of the damage and the need to confirm hazards like downed power lines, weakened structures, and residual hotspots have been cleared before residents can move back in. Governor Ferguson confirmed he had personally spoken with President Trump by phone about the situation, saying the president expressed support for what the affected residents are going through. And the governor said Washington had already requested immediate support from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, with a separate request for longer-term recovery funding underway, as officials look beyond the immediate firefighting effort toward the rebuilding process ahead. Senator Maria Cantwell noted that the Autumn Lane fire specifically had been designated the highest priority wildfire in the entire nation, a classification that ensures Washington receives prioritized access to federal firefighting resources at a moment when, as Commissioner Upthegrove noted, 15 separate fires burning simultaneously across the state were stretching the combined capacity of federal, state, and local firefighting agencies. That national prioritization is part of why the state has been able to draw in firefighting crews from more than a dozen other states, along with international support from Australia, a country with its own extensive experience battling large, fast-moving wildfires and a long-standing history of sending crews to assist during severe fire seasons in the United States. Beyond the fire itself, the infrastructure disruption across the region has been significant. Nearly 12,000 utility customers across Washington were without power as of Sunday, the vast majority of them concentrated in the Spokane area, according to the outage tracking service poweroutage.us, a combination of fire damage to power, infrastructure, and in some cases, preemptive shutoffs by utility companies working to reduce the risk of downed power lines, sparking additional fires during the high wind conditions expected through the weekend. For residents already displaced from their homes by mandatory evacuation orders, that kind of widespread power outage adds another layer of disruption to an already chaotic situation, complicating everything from staying informed about evacuation status updates to simply keeping food refrigerated and medical equipment charged for anyone with health conditions requiring reliable electricity. There's at least one genuinely encouraging piece of forecast news buried inside this weekend's reporting, and it's worth understanding clearly rather than glossing over. CNN's coverage of the ongoing situation noted that firefighters were expected to get their most favorable weather conditions in several days come Monday, with light winds and a high temperature around 80 degrees, a meaningful break from the 45-mile-an-hour gusts driving the weekend's rapid fire spread. But officials were equally clear that this break in conditions would not last, with temperatures expected to climb back into the 90s later in the week, meaning any progress firefighting crews make during Monday's more favorable window needs to translate into real, durable containment lines before the heat and, potentially, the wind return later in the week and threaten to undo hard-won gains. This is exactly the kind of narrow, time-limited opportunity that incident commanders have to plan around carefully, using a single day of calmer weather as aggressively as possible to establish and reinforce containment before conditions deteriorate again, rather than treating it as genuine, lasting relief. It's worth placing this weekend's fires within the broader wildfire pattern that's defined much of the western United States this particular summer, because Spokane's emergency didn't happen in isolation from everything else covered on this channel in recent days. This is the same region, and in some cases, the exact same underlying heat dome, responsible for the record temperatures across California, Arizona, and Nevada earlier in the weekend, and the same broader atmospheric pattern that had already prompted the U.S. Forest Service to flag enhanced wildfire risk across most of Southern California's interior, away from the coastline, even before lightning struck the ground near Spokane. The connection between extreme heat, single-digit humidity readings, and elevated fire danger isn't a coincidence playing out separately in different states. It's a single, interconnected pattern where the same ridge of high pressure baking the southwest with record temperatures is simultaneously drying out vegetation and setting the stage for exactly the kind of explosive fire growth Spokane experienced once lightning provided the ignition source. Washington's own governor had already declared a state of emergency and banned most outdoor and agricultural burning statewide through the end of September before this specific weekend's fires even ignited. A preemptive move based on the broader elevated fire danger building across the state, and the National Weather Service's particularly dangerous situation red flag alert for eastern Washington, an unusually rare designation reserved for the most extreme fire weather conditions, was already in effect specifically covering the region where these fires ultimately broke out. If you're anywhere in the affected area right now, whether you're one of the 60,000 people currently displaced from Spokane, a resident elsewhere in Washington watching this situation develop, or simply someone living anywhere in the West where elevated fire risk has become a recurring summer reality, there are concrete things worth understanding and acting on. If you're currently under a mandatory evacuation order, comply with it immediately rather than waiting to see how the situation develops, since fires driven by 45-mile-an-hour wind gusts and ember-driven spotting can advance far faster than a visual assessment from your own property might suggest. Exactly the kind of speed that turned a lightning strike into a 600 structure loss within a single weekend. If you're in an area that hasn't yet been ordered to evacuate, but sits near active fire activity or within a broader region under an elevated or extreme fire weather alert, use any available time now to prepare rather than waiting for an official order, gathering important documents, medications, a change of clothes, and any irreplaceable items into a bag that's ready to go at a moment's notice, and identifying in advance where you'd go and what route you'd take if an evacuation order does come. Sign up for your county's emergency notification system if you haven't already, since these systems are specifically built to push evacuation orders and updates directly to your phone, often faster and more reliably than relying on television coverage or manually checking news apps throughout the day. If you've already been evacuated and are waiting to learn the status of your home, understand that officials working through this kind of large-scale multi-fire event need real time to safely reopen affected neighborhoods, exactly as Major General Welsh indicated in asking for residents' patience, since crews need to confirm hazards like downed power. Lines, structurally compromised buildings, and lingering hotspots have all been addressed before it's genuinely safe to allow people back into a burned area. If you're trying to check on the status of a specific address or neighborhood, official county and state emergency management channels, rather than secondhand social media reports, remain the most reliable source for accurate, up-to-date information as the situation continues evolving hour by hour. And if you're anywhere in the broader region and outdoor burning restrictions are in effect where you live, treat them as genuinely critical safety measures rather than a bureaucratic inconvenience, given how directly the combination of drought-stressed vegetation, extreme heat, and high wind can turn even a small, seemingly controlled spark into the kind of fire that displaces 60,000 people within a matter of hours. Stepping back from the immediate emergency response, here's the piece of this story worth sitting with once the fires themselves are eventually brought under control. What happened in Spokane this weekend is, in a very real sense, the fire risk story warned about just days earlier finally playing out in its most severe form. Extreme heat and single-digit humidity drying out an already drought-stressed landscape, followed by lightning providing the ignition and powerful wind gusts providing the fuel for explosive, ember-driven spread across a populated area faster than firefighting crews could establish containment. 60,000 evacuated residents, 600 confirmed structures destroyed, 15 separate fires burning simultaneously across the state, and a fire response effort large enough to require crews from more than a dozen states and international support from Australia, all traces back to the same underlying pattern of extreme heat and drought that's been building across the American West throughout this summer. The genuinely encouraging news, 0 confirmed fatalities so far, despite the scale and speed of this event, reflects both fortunate circumstances and what appears to have been an effective, well-executed mass evacuation effort under extraordinarily difficult conditions. But with temperatures expected to climb back into the 90s later this week, and containment on these fires still incomplete even after Monday's brief window of more favorable weather, the situation is genuinely not over, and the recovery process for the families whose homes were among those 600 lost structures is really only just beginning. We'll keep tracking this closely as it develops, whether firefighting crews are able to establish meaningful containment during Monday's window of calmer weather before conditions deteriorate again later in the week, when displaced residents are able to safely begin returning to their neighborhoods, and how the broader wildfire situation across Washington, Oregon, and Idaho continues to evolve as this extreme fire season progresses. Subscribe and hit that bell icon right now so you don't miss those updates. Because with containment still at essentially 0 on some of these fires and hotter, potentially windier conditions forecast to return later this week, this story is very likely still in its early chapters rather than its conclusion. And drop that comment below if you haven't yet. Wherever you are, tell me if you've ever lived through a wildfire evacuation yourself and what that experience actually taught you about how quickly you'd be able to get out if you had to do it again. See you in the next one.